Welcome back to our next no-code video on the basics of the WAMZ stack. Now, in the previous video we did a quick overview. We also built out a very basic UX on Webflow, and we talked about how you can use Webflow versus Airtable versus Zapier versus MemberStack. Well, in this video we're going to dive further into Airtable. We're going to set up the database for our Rate My Doggy product. And we're also going to do the same thing on the Webflow CMS, and I'll show you how these two match up and what they can be used for. So, first of all, we're just going to set a quick name for this Airtable. Let's just call it the doggy database. And we're going to need a few things in here. First of all, we're going to need a table for the ratings. So we'll pop that in there. We're also going to need a table for the dogs, and we're going to need a table for, let's say, users. Now, we don't have to save all of this information in here. We can do it if we like, but we don't need to. I'm just going to delete these columns. And the reason for that is because we're using 4 different tools, and all of these tools are kind of trying to be standalone tools on their own, quite often we're going to run into some redundancy. And the best example of that is between Airtable and the Webflow CMS. So Webflow CMS is essentially going to let you create different collections and add fields to it in the exact same way that Airtable does right now. And as you can see, I'm just deleting the default fields so that I can go ahead and add new ones. And by the way, you can just hit customize field type and completely change it, but I just don't do that for some reason. So you do get this overlap. You need to have the content on Webflow if you want to save it or work with it on Webflow specifically. If you, for example, how we're creating ratings here, right? So if we want to show those ratings on Webflow, then we have to put them on Webflow CMS. On the other hand, if we wanted to work with our data purely on Zapier, or we wanted to manipulate it directly on Airtable without having to touch Webflow, then that's a great time to have all that data saved here. It's also worth having it backed up on another platform, and it means you can kind of work with it more like a database than in Webflow. Webflow CMS is quite restricted in what you can and can't do, whereas Airtables, it's really, really easy to go in, directly manipulate the data and work with it. But at the end of the day, we can't deny it. There is definitely going to be some redundancy, and as a bit of an example, on the NoCode.Tech website, if I click onto a tool, let's check out Backendless, which is our current tool of the month here in April. If I go and have a look here, there's all sorts of different information stored all over the place here. And everything that you can visually see is on the Webflow CMS. If I was to pop open my CMS, we've got tool information, we've got tutorial information, etc., etc. But we also have a ton of information about that tool that we save, which is useful to us as an editorial team, but we don't actually make available to the user. For example, we'll save information about whether or not Backendless is it ready to show? Is it the tool of the month or not? When's it due to be the tool of the month? What's our content schedule like around about that tool? Are we going to share it with anyone? All these different pieces of information that we keep, and some of it either gets used in our Zaps or gets moved along to Airtable, along to Webflow eventually, but the majority stays in Airtable. So there is a little bit of overlap, but nothing to worry about too much. So in our ratings, we're going to have a few different things then. So we're going to have, first of all, a number. So we're going to have the rating of the dog. Is that dog a 1 or a 5? We're also going to have a comment. So we're going to have the rating comment. We're going to have a note of the CMS ID. Now I'm going to come back to what that is in a minute. And we're also going to note the user ID. And again, I'll come back to what that is in a minute as well. So we've got our rating, we've got the rating comment. The other thing that we did, is the dog. So we're going to have, we'll call this a relationship field. Where is it? Oh, sorry, right at the top. I'm really stupid. So we're going to have a field that links to our dog record. And you could do that for the user as well. I'm going to skip it just for a little bit of simplicity, but we're going to have the dog related here as well. You've got name. We don't really need a name for this. I'm just going to change that to what we call an auto number, and that will just give this a unique automatic ID number for every record. If I just keep adding blank records, it's going to go 4, 5, 6, 7, so on and so forth. But I'll delete all them for now. And actually, just as a, let me just change that, sorry, to ID. Just probably as an example of what this is going to look like, let's just add one in. So that's going to start at ID 6 purely because I had fields before. But I'm going to say the rating is 5. The rating comment is that dog is so fluffy. We don't know the dog yet, we don't know the CMS ID, we don't know user CMS ID. We'll come back to what those CMS IDs are, but let's jump into dogs. We're going to set the dog up. So we've got the name of the dog. We don't need ratings in there, let's delete that. Oh no, sorry. Nearly deleted the relationship field. I was wondering there why I had that in there. So that's a field that's automatically created to tie a rating to a dog. That's a relationship field. I do not want to delete that. So that's going to give us a list of all of the ratings. And we can give it a total rating count. So we can make a number which is a total count of that rating. And we'll just set that to an integer rather than a decimal. If you've seen our data types video, then you'll know there's a difference there. So we've got ratings, we've got total rating count. What other information might we have? Well, we're going to have the CMS ID. Now you could have a bunch of information about the dog in here. We could have, for example, a photo of it. We could have, I don't know, the height, the breed, etc. We'll worry about that later. In fact, we'll put breed in just for now. But we'll worry about that later because we're going to keep the majority of this data in the Webflow CMS. So let's just say we can add a dog. We'll call this one Milka, after the German chocolate. Total rating count right now is 0. The breed is a Samoyed. We're going to have Honeybee, which is the name of a dog I used to have. And it is not my first pet, in case MD's thinking about security questions. So we'll have a pug there. We've got Milka, let's have Mocha. If anybody gets the reference, please email me, purely because that would be funny. We'll have a Pomeranian. I don't know if I'm spelling that right, but let's just say that's the 3 dogs that we've got in a minute. So we've just set up our database. We've got a bunch of ratings, or we've got a bunch of columns for ratings that don't exist yet, and a little demo one, and then we've made 3 different dogs. We can make more in the future, but for the minute, let's look at the Webflow CMS. So, just a quick reminder, we want Airtable as the master store of our data. It is where the source of truth is going to be, but we want to use Webflow CMS as a way to pull data in here, or store data in here in Webflow, so that we can actually use it visually on our designs. So we're going to have a collection here called ratings. In fact, we'll start off with dogs, just so I can kind of show you how the basic fields set up. So we've got the name of the dog, we get the slug, those are the 2 basic fields. The slug is just like what's the URL of it, so it could be like ratemydoggy.com / and then whatever the slug is what you get after the slash. So it could be ratemydoggy.com / Milka or / honeybee or whatever it might be. So we'll add a field. We're going to have the total rating. And we'll set that as an integer. We'll set the minimum number as 0, the maximum number we'll leave unlimited, so we'll just leave that blank. We don't want to allow negative numbers, so we'll leave that, and we don't really want to make it required, just because there's no real reason to make something required unless you are trying to set up a CMS that somebody, you know, like an editor, for example, can't get wrong. You know, if you want to make sure that somebody always puts an image into an article, then maybe you should make it required. But other than that, it's probably worth just leaving it free, because that lets you, it gives you a bit more flexibility later on when you're working with Zapier and the API, etc. So that's our total rating. I'm just going to leave the help text, you don't need that. We've got total rating, we're going to have an image, which will be a dog picture. We could also have the breed, of course. We'll do the breed, we'll do a single letter, and let us do, what else do we need? Breed, baby. We'll just have a description as well, just something we can fill in. Excuse me, dog description. You can do multiple line there, just change the text field type, and that'll let us type a little bit more for that specific dog. So I can add a ton more fields here, you know, there's all sorts of different bits and pieces I can add, but that's kind of all I need. Create a collection. And then we're going to go ahead and by the way, one of the things you can do here in Webflow is you can hit add 5 items or add 10 items, and it'll just put some sample items in there. Now obviously it's just going to come up with total, random stuff, but it's a good way if you're just testing your app out to quickly generate some data items to work with there. I'm going to delete them because we don't need them. But what we will do is we'll create a new dog. We'll do that in just a second. I'm going to show you how you can do that really quickly with AirTable. But first, let's just add our ratings. Now we're going to do something slightly different here. If I look across Airtable, I've got various different things here, like the rating of the dog, rating comment, etc, etc. And I've also got these things around CMS IDs and whatnot. I don't actually need them in Webflow. All I'm going to put is the rating comment. So we'll put rating comment. And again, every rating is going to have a name. That's okay. We can mess around with that. We'll get the rating comment. We'll put the rating number in. Rating number. Now whether that's out of 5, out of 10, etc. doesn't matter. We're not going to specify that in the database. We could if we really wanted to, but instead what I'm going to do is just use the Zapier logic to control that. But if I really wanted to, I could put the maximum number in here as 5 or something like that. I could put the minimum number there as 0. But as I say, I'm just going to leave it. So we'll have a rating comment, we'll have a rating number, and we're also going to have a reference. So clearly we've talked a lot about relationships before. If you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say a database relationship, then go and take a look at our database lesson in the No Code Fundamental Pillars series. But essentially what we're going to do here is set up a reference, and that's just Webflow's way of saying a relationship, and we're going to create a reference to the dog. So what comment is this dog about? What dog is this comment about? So we've got there, I'll specify the label or the name of this field as dog. The collection is going to be dogs, and we'll save the field. We'll then hit create collection. We could add some more fields in there. We're not going to bother for now. So let me show you something then. So if I go and take dogs, one of the options that I am going to have is to essentially I can either download this as like a CSV, or I can copy the information. But if I pop in here, I was going to hit share there, but if I hit download CSV, one of the things that I can do is I can grab this as a spreadsheet. A CSV, if you haven't heard of it before, is just a bit like an Excel file. It's just more generic. It's a CSV. It works in any spreadsheet application. So, because one of the things we want to do here, right, is we want to make sure this database looks the same as this database, and you've got 3 key ways to do that. Number 1, you can download a CSV and import it, which we're going to do in a second. Number 2, you can use Zapier or a tool like Zapier to programmatically, using an API, move the data from Airtable over to Webflow via API. Or the other way you can do it is just manually go and type it all in yourself. I'm going to do it with a CSV just to kind of show you. So if I go back to my CMS, if I hit import, if I drag this dog's grid view in here, it will say, is this your CSV's header row? I want to hit yes, it is. And essentially I can just map in all these fields. So it knows that the name data from the previous Airtable field here, that's automatically going to map to name, and you can see the data appearing, so Milka, etc. We're not going to import the ratings, we're not going to import all that because we don't have it, but we are going to map the existing field breed across. Now we're leaving the CMS ID, we're leaving total rating count, we're leaving ratings. I'll show you why. So if I import these 3 dogs, that should take about 2 seconds because it's barely anything. And then if I go into Milka, etc., then I've got the data there. I don't have ratings, etc. yet because we've not made any. Now look at this little thing down here, it's called item ID. This is what we call the CMS ID. So again, CMS stands for Content Management System, which is Webflow's way of saying database. And essentially this here is a unique identifier for this particular row in the database. So Mocha has a row, Milka has a row, Honeybee has a row. And if I take that and I pop it in the CMS ID field, then I'm going to be able to do things with that later. So if I pop that in there, that's the CMS ID. And I'm going to do the same with Honeybee. And I'm going to do the same with Mocha. I think I just mixed Mocha and Milka's up actually, didn't I? I didn't expect them to be round the opposite way. So if I put Mocha in there, and let's grab Milka. They're just sorted differently on this database, and I'll pop that in there. So now what I've got is, on my Airtable, because I've got each of these ID numbers and they're all different, I now have a way to uniquely reference this CMS ID here. So if you think back to the CRUD methodology lesson, I can now perform CRUD operations on each of these from my database using Zapier in a programmatic fashion. You know, we can now set stuff up to change the rating, for example, or do whatever it is we want to do. So I'll save that for now. I'm not going to import any ratings because clearly I don't really have any yet apart from this dummy rating. We'll maybe put that dummy one in just so we've got it, I suppose, because then we can experiment. So we'll just give it the number 6, rating 6, because we'll just use the ID number, which was 6 there. We'll say the rating is 5. What was the comment? It was "that dog's so fluffy." I'll just copy and paste that. And there we go. So if I pick a dog, it's going to give me the options, right? So we're going to say that comment is about Milka. And we'll create that. So we've got that. And if I pop back here, one of the things that I can do is, because I've got this relationship field with dog, I can now specify Milka. So I can now say that rating is about the dog Milka. And similarly, I've specified that back here in my CMS. Now that might seem like a bit of a pain. You might be wondering, well, why am I taking the time to manually match these up? Well, at the minute I'm only doing it so that we've got data for demonstration purposes, but actually what we've done is we've made sure that all the data that we've got in our database table here, all the fields that we've got that we need, we've now replicated over here. The bit that we need to sort now in the next lesson is how we look at actually moving data from one place to the other. But there's one other thing I just want to show you, and that is the use of a roll-up field. So one of the things that I can do here is, now that I've got this relationship to Milka, I can pull the ID of the Milka record through to this table as well. So by using a roll-up field and choosing a CMS ID, let me just show you what happens if I immediately create that field. Oops, I forgot to put a formula in. If I immediately put that in, and I put in array join, that's going to bring the field in there. Now the reason I did array join is you've got, whenever you do a roll-up field, what it does is it pulls information through from a table that you're linked to. So you could pull through, you know, the dog's breed, whatever it is, and pull it into the CMS ID roll-up. Because you do array join, that means if you've got multiple CMS IDs, it will put them all one after the other with a comma in between them. So if I had 2 IDs in there, then I would just get, you know, this ID with a little comma, then another ID, etc. But that CMS ID, it's just pulled through, is from this field here. And similarly, if I made another rating, if I linked it to Mocha or Honeybee instead of Milka, then that would pull through that specific CMS ID as well. The last thing I'm just going to do is make sure that dummy rating that I created has a ID aligned to it as well. So now we've got the CMS ID. The one bit that we're missing is the user CMS ID, and that's okay, we'll come back to that later. But now we've set up our database to match Webflow. We have set up our Airtable to match all the different fields we've got in that CMS. We've put some dummy data in. Now we're ready to actually use this, play with it, and see what we can do next. So jump on to the next video and we'll get cracking from there.